Good morning. Welcome to the Dole Institute of Politics Post-Election Conference. I'm Bill Lacey, the director of the Dole Institute. This is our fifth post-election conference, our third that occurred on a midterm election, and we're delighted that everybody could join us today in our audience and on streaming video. We are delighted that Senator Dole could be watching yesterday for part of the sessions on streaming video and hope that he's watching this morning. I'm going to start by asking everyone to please turn off your cell phones. We will have a question and answer session after each of our morning sessions. We're starting our session 2. Right now we'll be starting session 3 at 11:30, so we'll have approximately 30-minute break between the sessions. Because we want to make sure that everybody gets a chance to ask any questions, we ask in our Q&A section, no comments and no statements, please. Just ask brief questions and only one question each. Please respect the right of others to ask questions. We do our Q&A here with two students carrying cordless microphones. Raise your hand if you have a question for one of the panelists or any of the panelists. They'll come around and we'll try to work the questions in. We will try to allow some time after each of the sessions this morning for the Q&A. To maximize time for discussion, we're not going to do detailed introductions of our guests on the panel. You do have full biographies that you could have picked up on the way in. If you want to get one of those, you can quietly go back and pick it up now, or you can pick it up during the break. But let me briefly introduce our guests today. Let me first say that Mr. Rob Collins, who's Executive Director of the National Republican Senatorial Committee, was with us yesterday. As I announced yesterday, had an obligation that required him to leave early this morning. So he isn't with us. We have Mr. Nathan Klein, Polling and Analytics Director from National Republican Senatorial Committee. Alex Isenstadt is a political reporter for one of my favorite internet websites, Politico. Joe Lenski, Executive Vice President, Edison Research. Joe is the only individual who's attended all 5 post-election conferences. Then we have Sean Trende, Senior Elections Analysis Analyst. I can't say it either, Sean. RealClearPolitics.com, one of my other 2 favorite internet political websites. Then we move over to my right, yes. Raul Alvillar, National Political Director of the Democratic National Committee. My good friend Dan Balz, Chief Correspondent of the Washington Post. Another good friend, John McLaughlin, CEO and partner of McLaughlin Associates, a Republican polling firm. Patrick O'Connor, political reporter of the Wall Street Journal. And Jen O'Malley Dillon, who's a partner with Precision Strategies and was deputy campaign manager in the president's 2012 re-election campaign. Please welcome our panelists this morning to the Dole Institute. Yesterday, and I'm not sure, how many of you were here for panel 1 yesterday? Raise your hands. Most of you are here. Okay, so we got the real junkies. Well, all of you will remember that yesterday 2 of the things that I thought that came out were really fascinating were, number 1, when we kind of took a sense of where were things after the president's re-election in 2012 at the beginning of the year. I think there was a pretty solid consensus that it was not a foregone conclusion that Republicans would have a big year, and that, as a matter of fact, I believe somebody quoted statistics saying there's about a 1 in 3 chance that Republicans would take control of the Senate. We talked yesterday about what went on in 2013 and how that changed, and really focused on kind of the pivoting point being the after the government shutdown, 2.5 weeks later, the government being brought back, and then at the same time the focus really shifting in the political narrative to the rollout of the Affordable Care Act, and how that was damaging and problematic for the Democrats and for the president. Jen O'Malley Dillon has had an issue come up this week too, has to leave in a few minutes, but I wanted to get a couple of her thoughts on some things before she has to depart. But Jen, we want to thank you for playing such an awesome role in this, and you had a great story last night too, which I'm gonna, for those of you who were at the Friends dinner last night, you know what I'm talking about. I have to follow up with you on that. I have to send you something I wrote about the Obama campaign people a couple years ago, which basically echoed what you said last night. So, but let me not get off on that tangent. If you look at the beginning of this year, let's kind of do a reset on the political environment at the beginning of this year, so we kind of get a common point to start from. By January, the president's approval had flipped from the previous January, And again, I'm citing all the data I cited on presidential job approval is from Gallup. And looking through the approval numbers for this year, the president's approval up to election day, his disapproval up to election day was always 50% or higher. And all of these folks can tell you how important presidential job approval is in terms of determining vote. What kind of a challenge did that, Jen, present? And I'd like Raul to get your thoughts on this too, and then switch to Nathan and John for the Republicans. But how did that affect, at that point in time, starting the year, how you guys felt about the campaigns, the level of optimism or lack thereof, and what did you start to advise candidates to do vis-a-vis their relationship with the president?
Yeah, I think I'll address this from a process sort of inside the committee perspective. We obviously came into January in a much different place than we had anticipated, not expecting what had happened with the rollout, and really grappling with what that meant for the entire map. At this point in a national committee, you've done a lot of recruitment. This is the period where you're building your campaigns. And to be honest, it was still early for historical measures to be in a place where we were building foundation on the ground. What we had to be really careful about is that we didn't let this moment define the rest of the cycle and didn't determine what was in play and what wasn't in play. So from a strategic point of view, we wanted to make sure we would have the most expanded map possible, the most Senate seats on the table, looking at not just defending our incumbents, but opportunities for pickup, and building a very smart campaign based on data, understanding the electorate and what our unique pathways to victory were, and giving ourselves the greatest flexibility possible. So once we came through this more tumultuous time in the national environment, we would be able to say, okay, come March, come the spring, this is where we are. This is where we were hopeful at that point we were going to get past this issue and be able to put it behind us. But how do we make sure that we are building the structure and the infrastructure? We're understanding the electorate. We understand not just the type of messaging we need, but the types of programs we need in each of these states in order to be successful. And at the same time, we're building these campaigns. We're looking for the leadership teams. We're putting people on the ground. And we're doing things that the committee had never done before. Really spending extensive time early on things that are actually quite expensive, but using data, trying to make sure that we had, in places like Louisiana, for instance, we didn't have voter files that had been used in a long time for all intents and purposes. In places like Arkansas and Alaska, there wasn't aggressive on-the-ground campaigns. And so when you're in Ohio, you have very rich and current data. When you're in these other states, you don't. And so it meant that we had to spend time building up some infrastructure that you don't typically have to do, that takes resources, and you're doing it as a gamble to some extent because you're not sure what's really going to be play and what's not. But I think that what we tried to do is be incredibly disciplined, really focus on the long term of what we need to accomplish and putting all of these states in the best position for winning, and then focus on our candidates being back in their communities and communicating at the local level, trying to, not make the situation worse with the rollout, but also recognizing that we weren't going to win by communicating about that. We weren't going to win by exacerbating the situation on our end. So how do we think about that in the context of the messaging that we were communicating and the kind of structure that we were building?
Raul?
With the caveat that I didn't start until March of that year, but I mentioned yesterday the four pillars of what the Democratic Party is, and we work with the different committees as a support for them. But I think what we saw, and we saw this in the Kay Hagan race, and to Jen's point, making this a local issue for candidates, and Senator Hagan was talking about education and what that looked like for North Carolinians. So I think that was an important piece in making sure that we are going to get our Democrats elected, and that was the purpose of, and what we were trying to do is get as many as we could and can get elected. And so I think that was a piece of it that we really tried to focus on in terms of the candidates, and then making sure that when we could step in as the Democratic Party to some of these committees and to some of these candidates in some of these elections around the country, that we could step in and help where we needed to, whether it was with the data that we provided to these candidates or if it was monetary support for them.
Let me just ask both of you, I'll try not to make this too sharp a question, but how worried were you at, beginning of the year about the president's job approval? Or how worried were most Democratic strategists? Was that something that was becoming an overriding concern at that point, or was that something that, you were just kind of keeping your heads down and trying to do the blocking, the tackling, the planning to offset that?
No, we were worried. We were worried, and we also, as I was said, we were part of this, massive data project. We were looking really at an individual level in all of these states, and the numbers were reflecting that our worry was warranted. We certainly believed that we were at a low water mark. And that's, for a strategist and a political operative, you have to remember that. Even the best data is a snapshot of a moment in time. And so we couldn't build our operations or our perspective just based on that. However, we knew that it was going to take a lot of work to get beyond where we were, and that we had to come back. I mean, one of the major things that we had to do is keep coming back to the electorate, keep coming back to the polling and the models to see where things were shifting. We certainly did pull back, and did much better for us in terms of our internal numbers moving forward in the spring and the summer. But at that point, we were concerned, but we were even more focused on the importance of building the infrastructure so that when the environment got a little bit better, when people were paying more attention, we were able to really capitalize on that. The other thing I'd say is at this point, even with some of our top incumbents, people did not know much about the elections. Certainly with a lot of our traditional presidential Democratic voters that are not traditional midterm voters, as we were doing different research and communicating with people, there's not only questions about who was running, even for our incumbents, who had very high name recognition, but when the election was, and why it mattered, and how it connected to what's happening nationally. So there was a lot of education work that we knew we had to do just to inform people about the election, and that had nothing to do with the national environment, and allowed us to really focus on some of the more programmatic stuff we were doing.
Yeah, and to that point, we at the Democratic Party, we spent a lot of money just to let people know that there was an election. As Jen said, a lot of people weren't paying attention. I think we did some focus groups in Michigan, and people were saying, "Oh, what? There's an election." We thought the next election was going to be when we were going to vote for president. So we did a lot of focus groups. We did a lot of targeted radio spots to let people know. We came in and said, "Hey." We did very targeted states, North Carolina, Georgia, a number of those places to let people know. And to answer the question, yes, absolutely, we were worried. We wanted to make sure that candidates had the best opportunity that they could have to run in their states. And so I think that was part of the plan of making sure that we afforded those candidates that opportunity.
Okay, I want to switch to Nathan and John, and start with you, Nathan. Rob took a lot of time yesterday, which I really was so happy that he did, to outline the approach the Senatorial Committee took early in the cycle to getting the right candidates and preparing the right candidates, and getting them ready to run regardless of what the election is going to look at like. And then he talked and described some of the real severe fallout that you guys faced from the shutdown, and then how that began to turn around later in last year. When you guys kind of came to the office in January and were looking at things, how much better did you feel about things, and kind of what was your outlook at that point?
Well, excuse me, we certainly felt better in January than we did in October. But we were still, what's important to remember is we were still a long way away from being in a position where people were starting to think that it was a real possibility we would accomplish what we did. I was just making a list here. We still didn't have candidates. We still had primaries going on or hadn't recruited yet in Iowa, Colorado, North Carolina, Georgia, New Hampshire, Alaska. A lot of these things weren't decided until much, much later. So it was very important for us to take this moment and let it become part of a defining narrative, not so much for the voters, but more, again, inside the Beltway, and as we were trying to recruit and trying to talk to our donors and let them understand that the historical modeling that we believed in, that Rob described yesterday, that was so important to his decision just to take the job in the first place and attempt this, that there was a possibility that it could really shape up that way. Pointing to President Obama's job disapproval hitting that 50% mark it's a critical number nationally, and we also started seeing some significant buyer's remorse in the polling that was coming out of states like Colorado and Iowa. We were a long way away from executing a campaign that was capable of taking advantage of that. And in that situation, it became all the more important that we worked with all of the viable candidates in some of these races. There were 3, 4, 5 people in some of these primaries that we invited out, that we were working with, providing training, providing information. Because again, it wasn't about picking and choosing candidates. It was ensuring that whichever candidates we got were capable of running these general elections and capable of winning these races. Because as we talked earlier, when this cycle started, we had basically 7 states that people thought we could go after, and we had to win 6 of them if we were going to be successful. The ability to expand the map into these states like Colorado and Iowa was critical to our eventual ability to win. And at that point, it simply wasn't yet there. So making Obamacare, making the rollout, making his job approval numbers kind of a central theme of everything that we were doing was absolutely critical to the recruitment process and absolutely critical to getting more participation from the mid and lower level activists, volunteers, and donors throughout some of these states. As Jen mentioned, a lot of these are not targeted presidential states. They're not targeted states at all in many years. So in terms of mobilizing a base and convincing people it's worth it to come out and campaign in Arkansas, where Pryor is seen as an institution by many of the Republicans and the older, still registered Democrat, but people that we were trying to target, convincing them that this was a viable option, to get engaged, to get enthusiastic about this cycle. It was really a critical time for the first 3 months of the year there.
Okay. John, do you want to comment kind of on what you were advising your clients beginning of the year and telling them to do
I was more
in reaction
involved.
to the environment?
We were more involved in the House side. In 2013, we'd done research for getting their messages ready to focus on the middle class. And politically, and like I said, in our surveys, because we're doing national stuff of but likely voters, not just registered voters, but people that are more likely to vote, because you're expecting the turnout to drop by about 40 million, and it dropped by more than that. And you're focused on 2 groups. You're focused on, I was, in 2013, we were watching this, we were focused on 2012 voters that didn't vote in 2010 because we thought the Democrats would motivate that pool of Obama voters to come back out. It was definitely more skewed towards the Democrats in that group. But we would pick off Republicans and independents in that group that disapproved the job the president was doing and try to get them out and motivate them. And at the same time, we were definitely focusing on those who disapproved the job the president was doing, but were not voting Republican. And they tended to be women, more likely to be women, moderates, independents. They would react to the economic and jobs message, and there was also a security component to it, which I think a lot of people, weren't, even on our side of the fence, a lot of the strategists and campaigns you were involved in, they would focus more on just economics, and they say, or Obamacare, and it's about nothing else. And later on in the year, when ISIS, Ebola, and immigration popped up, you had voters it was in the post-elections it was showing too. So the work then was done early, but it was also not to concede anything. I mean, just as a case, I worked for the governor and lieutenant governor of Georgia, Governor Dole, and Lieutenant Governor Cagle. And we were focusing on, because the Democrats had a good plan, where they were based on demographics, based on that, they were trying to motivate the 2012 voters, and they were hoping the Republicans wouldn't be as motivated. And we had primaries to deal with. And they were focused on motivating their base beyond what it was in 2012. And we went after their base. I mean, we early on, the governor we identified African Americans who were conservative, who were likely to, maybe vote for us on a host of issues. And in the post-election surveys, depending upon which post-election, but 10, 11% of the vote we got for the governor, and that was the margin to avoid a runoff. Lieutenant governor got 58%. In my last poll, he had 19% of the African-American vote. And we also targeted independent women. We just didn't concede them. And so the issues, jobs, charter schools, Hope scholarships, was all targeted at these swing voters so that we could kind of deflect their strategic plan and make sure that we won by what we needed to win. And one of the other things, because Georgia's unique with 30% African-Americans, the governor never attacked Obama in a single ad. The outside groups did, but we never did, because we wanted those votes, and we think the future is we can attract those, we can attract parts of what the Democrats view as their core coalition And, you know, when later on when you talk about the future, I think there's going to be major shifts, and we'll get some of their vote, and they may get some of ours, but it should be a net plus for Republicans.
Yeah, I want to see if anybody else has a reaction. In particular, Sean, I was curious about your thoughts beginning of this year. I know that you've written a lot about how job approval affects vote and everything. What were your thoughts at the beginning of the year, and how were they different from how they were, I think you mentioned, in June or July of 2013?
Yeah, about the beginning of this year is when I really started to think, wow, the bottom could really fall out for the Democrats. Yeah, I kind of think of elections as, believe it or not, a ladder going into a tidal pool. Okay, and I'll explain this. You have a 50-rung ladder, and the top rung is the most Democratic state in the country. I'm sorry, the most Republican state in the country, Utah. And the bottom rung is the most Democratic state, which is Hawaii. And then the tidal pool rises and falls with presidential job approval. And as the president's job approval falls, blue states increasingly go above sea level. And so when the president was up at 50%, it really was just a 6 or 7 state map. But when he starts falling down to 40%, that means in a state like Iowa or Colorado, he's probably at 43, 42%, which is a really dangerous place to be running as an incumbent. And so I actually did a really simple, the interesting factoid, no Democratic Senate candidate over the past 3 cycles in a competitive race has run more than 10 points ahead of the president's job approval in the state. The exception is actually Joe Manchin of West Virginia, but we just forget about it, so I can say no Democratic senator has done that. Joe Manchin is Joe Manchin. You don't get too many of those these days. And so I looked back to 2010 and 2012 and just did a simple regression analysis looking at presidential job approval in the state on election day and incumbency, and pushed it forward. And I said, look, if the president's job approval is 45% on election day, which is what his average has been in his second term, the Democrats will lose 8 seats. And if the president's job approval is 44%, which is where it actually was in the exit polls, the Democrats will lose 9 seats, which is what happened. So that was the point. And the press was actually very slow to kind of catch up on this, but I'd say January really was the time where you could start looking at the numbers and saying that this could get really, really ugly.
Okay, anybody else want to comment or jump in, Jen?
Yeah, I just wanted to add, I mean, from a practical perspective, you know, we certainly started with, okay, we're going to feel good about right now where Iowa was. We were going to feel okay about Michigan, New Hampshire. We wanted to make sure we had some strong operation there, but we felt okay. You know, we really are going to dig in on you know, Kentucky. We're going to see what we can do in Georgia. You know, we know we have some more vulnerable places, you know, Arkansas and Alaska. And so, you know, we still had a perspective of we have opportunity, we're going to defend, but our focus is going to be on some of these places that, you know, that as we shifted into the cycle and as the numbers continued to stay hard for us, our priority and our focus had to shift. Now, that wasn't to say we were ever at a point where we weren't paying attention to Iowa, but certainly after coming through the primaries, and I know I'm getting ahead, but, you know, that's where we were shifting. You know, I spent a lot more time in Iowa than I anticipated this cycle, to be completely honest, and I love Iowa, but I would much rather have spent more of my time in Kentucky, and that was really a shift in the dynamics, and then really what it meant from us from a practical perspective at the committee and how we had to spend our time and our resources and our focus.
Okay, anybody else want to react?
Yeah,
Patrick?
Nathan's touched on it and Jen has as well, but this was like December, I think, just based on the president's numbers and his slide, December to January was that time where I think a lot of us political reporters started to think, well, maybe the map isn't 7 states. Maybe the map is bigger than that, because as I noted yesterday, to get the majority, Republicans would have had to win 6 of 7 states that Romney had won, or the president had lost, where Democrats were running for re-election or Democrats were trying to hold those seats. What happened in December and January is you saw Ed Gillespie starts to entertain a bid in Virginia. Now, did any of us think that he was actually going to win there? No, we didn't, but you know, that would require Democrats maybe to shift some money, or Mark Warner, who's a well-funded Democrat, was going to have to spend all of his money on that race instead of shifting it over to colleagues. Scott Brown is dangling the prospect of a New Hampshire Senate run. All of a sudden, there are polls, consistent polling coming out of Iowa and Colorado, to to suggest that those races are a lot closer than I think we had perceived them to be just a month earlier. Michigan, which never really materialized, the polling there actually was very favorable to the Republicans. So all of a sudden, I think from a perception standpoint, we were thinking about a 7-state map, and then all of a sudden it's getting to 11 and 12 states. Well, then that all of a sudden becomes a lot more doable for Republicans to win the majority because they don't have to have the inside straight that I referred to yesterday. They have a lot of options. Not all of those options needed to materialize, and they didn't. But, and you know, the other thing, and I don't know who pointed this out first, is when you do expand like that, these tend not to be like a 51-49 prospect. Everything tends to shift one direction or the other. You don't, you know, it's either 0 or 100. Which it may not make sense, but when the direction of the electorate is headed, when the electorate is headed in a certain direction, a lot of things tend to get swept up. And I think at that point, we really started to feel like, wow, you know, this not only do Republicans have a chance, but maybe there's a chance that this could be a very big election for them. That said, there was still this big looming prospect of party primaries, and we were just not sure how they were going to navigate that. But I think at that point, the kind of January, February phase was when we really started to think, wow, this could be real. And I will say that I think the biggest date for me following the elections was when Cory Gardner announced that he was going to run in Colorado, because the numbers looked really good in Colorado, but they were running, the Republicans looked like they were going to run a candidate who had lost in a race that he should have won in 2010. And I think we all reflexively felt, you know, it was always, how are Republicans going to blow this one again? Because they had blown it in 12 and blown it in 10. And when Cory Gardner announced, all of a sudden you had a very real candidate running in a race that looked a lot closer than it had 2 months earlier. And I think from that point on, I know, speaking personally, I started to take the prospects of a pickup a lot more seriously than I had at any point earlier in the cycle.
Okay,
there was-
Jen, let me just say this real quickly, Jen. I think you need to catch a plane, and we don't want to make you late. So thank you very much,
Sorry.
and we appreciate your participation. We'll miss you for the rest of our sessions. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
I think Patrick makes that point. I think people underestimate in January, February, March, before the Republican primaries started, there was the assumption there were going to be 2 or 3 loose cannons nominated by Republicans, like in 2010 and 2012. So when you're looking at the Republicans needing to win 6 out of 7, and you're assuming a couple nominees are going to slip through that aren't going to perform, that looks really tough. But when it looks like they only have to win 6 out of 9 or 6 out of 10, and then the primary process starts, and those loose cannons aren't getting through, it made the path look a lot easier.
Yeah, let's shift to that topic. I want to keep moving along kind of briskly this morning because I have a lot of ground to cover. But let's shift to the topic of the GOP civil war, so to speak, the establishment versus the Tea Party. Joe made a very good point. Republicans got a lot of real bad candidates nominated over the past 2 election cycles and possibly lost 3 to 5 Senate seats because of that. Rob talked a little bit yesterday about what the NRSC did, the Senate committee did to try to fight that. But there were still some races that I thought I wanted to highlight. And there's one congressional race in particular that was a big surprise, I think. Maybe one of the biggest surprises, if not the biggest in the primary, and that was the House loss of Republican Majority Leader Eric Cantor. John, you knew the congressman. You've advised him on things. What happened in that race?
You know, and I thought you wanted me to gloat about the Republican November victories. But no, it became a surprise at the end. You could see what was going on because things happened in real time that something was going on here that wasn't. And one of the things, in all the years I worked for Eric for 15 years, we never released any of his polls. And the Friday before the election, they called me to release a poll that was done 2 weeks out. And, you know, in the primary cycle, we're fighting a lot of battles where, you know, we had, even the ironic part is we were doing Dave Jolly stuff from Florida 13. And that was a special where everybody was predicting a higher turnout in a certain way. And it came out our way. And my brother Jim, who's my business partner in this, he was doing the polling, and he was like, it's a dead even race. And we helped. Eric was a big factor in trying to get outside groups to help Jolly win. So we kind of understood that based on the things that we had before. We had primaries for Renee Elmers and Pittenger, and Comstock had even been in a primary before. and our numbers were really accurate. We were the only ones that have Kingston in a runoff, so the primaries were running like you normally ran them. What was different about this was the Democrats cleverly, and I'm sure it wasn't, had not put up an opponent there, and there was no Democrat primary on the other side. So 2 years before, we had a Tea Party challenge, and George Allen had a Tea Party challenge, and they both won with like 80% of the vote. But the highest turnout, which was the highest turnout ever in that district for a Republican primary, was 46,000 voters. And you know, for myself, unlike a lot of these other pollsters, we're outside of we have a small office in Washington, but we're outside the Beltway, and we survive by winning primaries. And for 30 years, we've been doing it where it's, you know, it's a very fluid group, but you identify people, and pollsters mostly poll people that voted in past primaries. So we were polling anybody voting in past primary on the Republican side in the district. And all of a sudden, we're getting the early reports on that day, and we knew things were going on because Gutierrez came in and hit us on immigration. The conservatives were popping us on, from the right on immigration. Huffington Post was telling Democrats, Ben Jones, who'd be beaten before, was telling people to go vote. And you could see it percolating over the weekend. And it wasn't necessarily planned as much as organic. Like if anybody took organic chemistry at Kansas University here, there's certain things you don't put together, otherwise you'll get an explosion. So we got that kind of explosion, and we did a post-election survey because on the election day, when I started throwing the first two precincts and we were losing and we saw the level, I was like, this is not good because there aren't that many Republicans in the district as far as primary voters. And they got 65,000 voters out. And they weren't in our samples that we were calling. So on our own expense, we ended up, you know, basically writing off the last survey, and we did our own survey of people that voted that day, and we put it up on our website. It's on McLaughlinonline.com with a lot of the other stuff that I was talking about, national surveys. It's in those national surveys I was talking about. But we put it up, and we put up the, you know, the top line, the crosstabs, you know, whatever, so people could see it as much as to serve, because we didn't know if this was going to be an aberration or some sort of trend. But we did 400 voters, and what was interesting about it is and we polled it like what we did was we polled it like it was a special election, like we did in Jolly's election. So we polled, the sample was created of like anybody voted in the 2010 or 2012 general elections, the last three Democrat primaries, the last three Republican primaries, and the Republicans were only 54% of the people that voted that day.
Compared to what would be normal, do you think? 2/3
to 3/4.
Okay.
So, and you had the Democrats, which are usually 2 or 3% with 13%. And it was really what happened was the aberration is the only time that Tea Party conservatives basically voted with Obama Democrats. They came in, they had a common target. So our base was split, and the Democrats were unified against us. And so you had that. I mean, things like what happened where you had 44% of the Republican primary voters were pro-choice. That was, you know, usually maybe it's only a quarter or a third. You had that. You had the conservative numbers were only just above half the voters. And when you looked at it, the Republicans, of the 54% who were, because they don't have registration, they have affiliation in Virginia, and it's an open primary. The 54% who told us they were Republicans, they voted 55 for Eric, 45 for Bratt. The non-Republicans, they voted against us. The independents voted 62 for Bratt, 38 for Cantor, and the Democrats voted 86-14 against us. The number of Obama approvals went up to a quarter in the primary, and they voted against us 80-20. The idea of if you voted in one of the last three Republican primary voters, we won 52-48. 2 out of 3, we won 56-44. If you voted in all three of the last three primaries, we won 62-38. Conservative Republicans, we won 54-46. But the problem was with these extra voters, people who had never voted in a Republican primary before, we were losing badly. So if they were in that 36% don't vote in Republican primaries, we lost 59-41. If they'd voted in a Democrat primary before, we lost 70-30. And if they disagreed with the Tea Party, which there were voters of, which was a third of the sample, we lost 65-35. So, so the margins of, we lost by 7,200 voters, but 3 in 10 voters based on records, because when we pulled the sample, we asked them, we knew if they'd voted in a Democrat primary. We lost that group 70-30. They provided 13,000 votes for a primary where we lost by 7,200 votes. So while our base was split, you're getting this unified opposition saying, why wait till November? We're going to come in and zap you now. And after that, we had primaries. I couldn't lose a dog catcher after that. I had to make sure everybody won. So but I had primaries in New York.
Were you doing any dog catchers races, John?
We do. If you pay, and I love to take surveys. So if regardless of what you're running for, that's how we get paid.
Okay, gotcha.
So, but we had not done a general election survey in the district because we had no general election opponent, and we probably needed to see that. But it was an expensive lesson. But I made sure that when Andrew Crenshaw was running in Jacksonville, we got 71%. We made sure it wasn't going to happen again. Richard Hanna's an upstate congressman, Zeldin, we won those primaries. But it went back to what you normally see. So there was a set of circumstances here that was really where you're looking at, when you look at November, how do we get Obama Democrats to vote Tea Party people? I don't think we're going to see that, too much. But there'll be primaries and there'll be things that change in the future. But unfortunately for Eric and ourselves, we were in the perfect situation for both sides to hit us pretty hard.
Right, okay.
Can I ask John a question on
Yes,
this?
Dan.
I mean, there was evidence of unrest on the right. One of our Virginia reporters was at the public meeting where
Right.
he got hit quite hard. And the question I've always had was, to what degree did you all think that was a serious threat, and what did you do about it to try to make sure that your own Republican base, conservative and moderate, was as solid as possible? Or did you not think that was going to be as difficult for you as it turned out to be?
No, we thought we had a serious fight, but we thought it was a fight within our own party. And they were spending money, they were taking polls, and the poll that was released was actually, when you're an incumbent, they always worry about what you've got, and then what you don't have is going to go against you. And that was a decline from the previous survey. And they were doing stuff. They were spending money, and they were in a real fight. But we thought it was a fight confined to independents who would vote in the Republican primaries and Republican primaries. We thought it was a big fight within the Republicans. What we didn't expect was the non-Republicans coming into the primary because they didn't have a primary on their side. And that was a surprise. That's where everybody got caught surprised. And I think even the Democrats were surprised by it. But but it was basically, that's where at the end, like you called me at the end, I knew exactly what was wrong. It was like, you have all these you just look at 65,000 versus 46,000, and you're saying they're not our voters. And we knew them. So
knowing now what you didn't know then, what could he have done?
we should have polled like a special election. And then we should have treated it like a special election that was open to everybody. I've done that before in Virginia primaries when they saw it coming earlier for state senators or House of Delegate candidates. And you try to bring new people into the process, where you try to say, okay, these are people that like Eric, that need to be motivated to come, that are outside the usual primary base. And because there were Republicans, a lot of people, it's a typical election after it's over, because there's only 65,000 in a district that'll produce 200,000 voters in November that will vote Republican. They're like, oh, we didn't think you were in trouble, so we didn't vote. But there were groups of voters outside the primary, usual primary voters, that you could motivate to come in if they were given the right messages and told that it was really important to vote. So, hindsight's 20/20, but that's, what's happened is we've studied it, we've put it out there. I don't know if you went to the website and looked at the old poll, but if you can go get the voter list now and see actually who voted and what their past history was, and you can match them up with their databases and everything. But that's what we need. We should have approached it like a special and then opened it up. And the tough part for Eric is he was going around the country extremely generous, campaigning for other people, helping other Republicans, raising money for other people. At that point, we were running, within the last couple of months, we were running a campaign in the district, making sure he was in the district, and spending a lot of money on advertising, mail, and organization, but it was concentrated on a typical primary, and this one was not a typical primary.
Okay, I want to move into the Senate primaries, and Nathan, I want to start with you for just any overall assessment of how you guys approached the primaries and the Tea Party challengers. But in particular, I want to hear a little bit about what I think was probably the most serious challenge when Senator Cochran in Mississippi, actually in the first election, I believe, received less votes than his eventual challenger. So I'd like to have you talk a little bit overall, but especially Cochran. Then I know Alex is quite familiar with Mississippi, and I want to get his thoughts on this too.
Absolutely. I'm not going to try to restate what Rob said so eloquently yesterday in terms of our approach when it came to some of these outside groups that were spending heavily in the primaries, that were challenging a lot of our incumbents, but rather more about the decision-making process. Early on, there was no question that we were going to get involved in primaries to support our incumbents. It got a little bit more complicated in some of the open seats where there are some people who would work with us, some who wouldn't. We generally took the attitude of we'll work with anyone if you want to work with us. But in some of these incumbent primaries, what people forget is we actually had a very, very early primary in 2013. Senator Enzi was challenged by Liz Cheney. And at the time, there was no question that we were going to help build out the operation for Senator Enzi. And it had nothing to do with disliking the Cheneys by any way, shape, or form. It was simply that we were the National Senatorial Committee, and it's our job to protect our senators. So when it came to Cochran, and he was being challenged by Chris McDaniel, the first time around, there was absolutely no question that we were going to support the senator. We were going to help him in any way that we could, help him build his operation. Had some people down there towards the end. When it really became challenging is, as you mentioned, he actually got less votes in the initial primary, about 1,400 less votes than his challenger, Chris McDaniel, and we were headed to a runoff. As John said, talking about the polling, when you're dealing with the incumbent, usually you get what you get, and the rest goes to the challenger. So from a purely historical perspective, from a momentum perspective, just evaluating this race, it was very difficult to look at the runoff and see the cost-benefit analysis to the entire map of, number one, antagonizing this other wing of the party that was supporting McDaniel, and number two, it's financial and time and resources that could be going to other races. I think it's clear at this point that we did decide to get in, and one of the people who deserves a lot of the credit for that in the decision-making process internally is named Luke Thompson, who's actually from out here. I believe his parents were here yesterday, and he sat down, and the problem with the runoff is you don't get the voter file back. We never had a chance to do a proper analysis of here's everybody who turned out, here's everybody we can target, here's everybody we could turn out, here's their addresses. We talk a lot about big data and politics. In a runoff, there's no time for data. You have to be on the ground the very next day. So the analysis literally broke down to here's 100 or so counties, and we plotted an analysis, Luke plotted an analysis, I should say, that basically said and it followed a fairly straight line, that the more likely a county was to vote for Senator Cochran, the less likely they were to turn out. So if the percentage turnout was down in that 5, 10, 15% range, we were winning by 30 or 35 points in those counties. In the counties that were turning out 25, 30%, I'm talking about the total general population is why the numbers are low for the primary. But those counties were split or they were going for McDaniel. And rather than targeting the African-American community or certain Democrats and saying, you have a chance to turn out and vote for Cochran, we just said, these are the counties where people like him, and they didn't realize how bad this is. And we had, unfortunately, can or didn't have, but we had the second chance to go out and basically get new voters into the primary, exactly what would have been done there. And it wasn't about changing the message. It was about engaging some new voters, and I believe Pat said yesterday that one of the things that came out of the government shutdown in October is, and I apologize if I'm misattributing this comment, that many of the moderate Republicans who had not previously engaged in the primary process, or moderate independents who kind of lean conservative, a lot of these guys who are involved realize that if we don't do something, there's going to be a group of 40 or 50 people who essentially can run this party, can shut down the government, can do whatever it is they want. And Senator Cochran long has cared very, very deeply about his state, and he's always been a constituent service type of senator. And going into these counties where we knew we could get more people, it was always about what he had done, his connection to the state. It wasn't ideological. It was never about, we're going to shut down the government if Obamacare doesn't get funded, and these sorts of what you hear a lot in the TV as the conservative primary message. We weren't trying to out-Obamacare the other guy, basically, which is what a lot of primaries look like these days. Instead, it was about everything that he had done and that connection and understanding that we could expand that. As I said, a lot of the credit goes to Luke, and a lot of the credit goes to Rob, who sat down with the poll that basically said you can't do it, and the county-by-county data that said you can do it. And we, throughout the cycle, had really been investing in rebuilding Republican on-the-ground efforts. And I think this was the first example in 2014 of it really working. In that, in the last 6 years, give or take, we've kind of been getting beat on the ground to the point where I am forced at this point to tell donors there's two numbers in national polling that when you look at, there's an inherent built-in advantage. When you look at the generic ballot head-to-head, there's generally about a 4-point advantage for Republicans built in simply because the more competitive districts aren't perfectly in line with the nation as a whole, because Democrats have more 90% districts and we have more 70% districts. But the enthusiasm number, the turnout number, and we saw this most pronounced in 2012, Democrats have an inherent built-in 4 to 5 point advantage, or at least they had for the last few years. I think this was the first time that we had a chance to get out there on the ground. Our data team, Luke led them, went down to Mississippi and started knocking doors themselves and went into these counties, and they didn't care about the demographic makeup necessarily. A lot of people reported it as targeting the African-American community. We just went to whichever county looked like they kind of liked that. And a lot of these were more rural African-American counties. And those are very different voters than an urban northern African-American community. And we just went in and said, you know Thad, he's been around for 40 years, he really needs your help. And so then the win in the runoff was really, I think, the first evidence that Republicans, if we put in the effort, if we put in the time, we can still get on the ground and win these things. And it can still be about our constituents and not this ideological fight.
Okay, Alex, you want to add something?
Yeah, look, I mean, the Mississippi, just sort of adding to what Nathan said, the Mississippi primary was one of the key contests of the year. And interestingly enough, there was a time when people thought that had Cochran lost to Chris McDaniel, who was his conservative challenger, Democrats could have made a serious play for this seat. They had this former congressman running, a guy named Travis Childers, and McDaniel and Childers, he's established himself as a moderate Democrat, and had he been able to run against McDaniel, who's this really conservative guy, even for Mississippi standards, very conservative, Childers, Democrats could have made a serious play for the seat. So for people at the NRSC like Nathan, that was a problem that they had to worry about for a time. But, it's interesting going back and looking at that primary for a couple of different reasons. And one of those is because if this was 2010, one wonders if McDaniel would have actually defeated Cochran. And, you look at Cochran and he's kind of a relic of D.C., right? He's been in Washington too long. He's not exactly someone who goes along with the Tea Party ideology. He's a classic earmarker. And so if this was 2010, you could see the Tea Party movement and someone like McDaniel really taking him out. But that didn't happen this year because you had people like the NRSC and the Chamber of Commerce and other Republican groups that said, look, we're going to help Cochran, who, by the way, really didn't seem to be that prepared politically for this primary. We're going to go in, we're going to help him, and we're going to make sure that he wins this race. And so you had the NRSC, people like Nathan and others doing a number of things to help Cochran out. Then you had a number of other groups that got involved in really interesting ways. One of those groups, the Chamber of Commerce, decided to run a TV ad for Cochran in the primary. That TV ad starred former NFL quarterback Brett Favre. Why Brett Favre? Because, well, Brett Favre is from Mississippi. And in that ad, you had Favre talking about how great Thad Cochran was. All these things made a difference. And the other thing is that, to some extent, Cochran's win in the runoff against McDaniel, it was owed to more traditionally Democratic voters, including African-American voters, some of whom, Republicans did reach out to, and some of these black voters were turned off by comments by people around McDaniel and McDaniel himself that were perceived to be racially insensitive. And that did help bring out some black voters to the polls, and it did help Cochran achieve this narrow win. And it was a really interesting race for all those reasons. And for a long time, people thought that had Cochran lost this race to McDaniel, that Democrats might have been able to make a serious play for this in the general election. And that didn't happen.
And we have evidence from the exit poll, because we did ask that question to Mississippi voters, who, if the Republican nominee had been McDaniel, who would you have voted for? And in that electorate, Childers actually beat McDaniel by 7 points, because 16% of Cochran voters would have switched to Childers, and another 14% would have stayed home and not voted for either one. So there is a lot of evidence that McDaniel could have been the Todd Aiken or the Richard Murdoch of 2014.
Okay, does anybody else want to jump in on this subject before we move along?
Yeah, this race to me was so interesting because Cochran fit the pattern of the classic incumbent who can get beat in the primary. And I went down just before the first round of voting, and my impression of him was of a candidate who was at best unprepared and at worst, a bad candidate seeking re-election. When I talked to him briefly about the race when I was down there, one of the things he said to me was he had thought that he was going to retire and essentially said, I got talked into running again. Well, that is not the type that you want for a candidate who's facing a serious challenge in the primary. The other thing, I talked to him after he had been at an event at a small hospital south of Jackson, and he gave what I would only describe generously as a fairly lackluster presentation at this hospital. And I said to him, you just spent 45 minutes here. You never, and you're at a hospital, you're at a healthcare facility. Healthcare is a big issue. You never once mentioned the Affordable Care Act. You never once said anything about Obamacare. I wonder why you didn't take the opportunity to drive something on that message. And his answer was frankly inexplicable. It was an answer that suggested that he thought that the Affordable Care Act was actually a pretty good thing, and that really, it was doing good things for people, and that maybe it needed some improvement. I got back in my car, and about 20 minutes later, I got an email from one of the people who was on the campaign bus with the senator, who said, "Can you call me?" So I called him, and he said, "Was that question that you asked, we're having a debate in the bus about that question that you asked the senator. Was that question about the Affordable Care Act, or was it about the VA scandal, which had popped up at that particular point in time?" And I said, "Well, it was about the Affordable Care Act." And he said, "That's what I thought," but he said Stuart Stevens, who was also on the bus, thought it was about the VA, and so did the senator. And he would like to talk to you again about this. And so at the next stop, I gave him another chance to answer the question. And frankly, he said he didn't think that Obamacare was particularly good, but even then did not deliver a message that was in any way aimed at those Tea Party Republicans who were defecting from him. And the difference between the Cochran that we saw in that first round and the Cochran that we saw in the runoff was significant. I mean, he finally began to develop a message, frankly, a quite democratic message, which was, in defense of big government and government largesse, which wasn't at all aimed at the Tea Party, obviously, but was aimed at all kinds of other voters. But he was very ill prepared, and I think that that you all were lucky that first round. I mean, because McDaniel came dangerously close to pulling that off in the first round, and for all of the reasons that we know certain incumbents end up getting beat, you guys were quite lucky in that first round.
John?
I'll be concise. Members of the press, don't make the quote, "Sean Trende defends Tea Party," because I'm not. But I do think when we're analyzing things, I think reporters make the same mistake that Tea Partiers make. Tea Partiers seem to think that all the Tea Partiers are great and the establishment candidates are awful. I think reporters are now kind of in a trap where if it's a Tea Party candidate, they stamp it with automatic loser. There's two problems. The first is we don't get the counterfactuals. I mean, personally, I think that even if Todd Aiken had lost the primary, that Claire McCaskill probably would have won in Missouri, or Missouri. I don't know how they say it around here. And I think if Sharon Angle had lost in the primary in Nevada, that Harry Reid, probably would have still won re-election against either of the other two candidates. We have Tommy Thompson in Wisconsin, George Allen in Virginia, Dino Rossi in Washington, all establishment candidates who defeated Tea Party challengers that went on to lose. If the Tea Partiers had won those primaries, we would put them on the list of seats that Tea Partiers cost Republicans. But we know for a fact that they didn't, because the establishment candidate won the primary and lost the general. You can go down Terry Lynn Land in Michigan, Denny Rehberg in Montana. So establishment candidates aren't invulnerable. I also think it's important to keep in mind that the Tea Party taketh away, but it also giveth. If you don't have the Tea Party, you have, instead of Marco Rubio, Charlie Crist, who, as it turns out, is everything that the Tea Party said he was. And instead of Pat Toomey, you have Arlen Specter, who, as it turns out, was everything that the Tea Party said he was. Instead of Ron Johnson, you have Russ Feingold, the most liberal Democrat in the Senate. Instead of Mike Lee in Utah, you have Senator Bennett, who was, kind of a moderate-ish Republican in the most conservative state in the country. You don't get Rand Paul, you don't get Ted Cruz. And so I think when we're analyzing these Tea Party candidacies, and I know the calculus at the NRSC is a little bit different, especially with respect to incumbents, but for analysts and reporters, when you're looking at Tea Partiers, the name of the game is not to stamp either faction with automatic loser or winner. It's trying to figure out the differences, and there are real obvious differences between a Mike Lee or a Pat Toomey and, say, a Milton Wolfe or a Rob Maness in Louisiana. That's the name of the game, I think.
Okay, that's an extraordinarily good point and worth all of us remembering. Let's move along. We talked, and Dan, you addressed this yesterday, as I mentioned earlier, kind of the shift from the shutdown to the rollout of the Affordable Care Act and how important that was. The president of the administration got hit with three pretty substantial issues in the middle of the year. John referenced this a few minutes ago: ISIS, Ebola, immigration. There were some other things as well. How did that change the environment to further benefit Republicans, or did it?
I can jump in. I think on the one hand, it was a further hit to the president. I know in our Wall Street Journal, NBC News polling, his numbers, approval for how he handles foreign policy dropped dramatically in August, September, kind of trickled down again in October. So it was one more question, one less attribute for the president, for Democrats. And I think it also really complicated the kind of narrative, the things that we talk about. It took the White House is, it's the biggest megaphone in American politics and probably the world, and it really, because the press was focused on two things that were almost entirely out of the White House's control, or one thing that was entirely out of the White House's control and another thing that was kind of a big question. We weren't sure how the White House was going to respond, and it wasn't catering to the president's strong suit. It just complicated the message mix for Democrats and created one more kind of big variable heading into November that I think complicated their efforts to push back on what was already a pretty terrible environment.
I think it also crowded out news about the election and attention paid to the election. That Jen mentioned earlier, how many people didn't even know there was an election. And that actually got worse during the campaign because all these big news stories shoved out the election from the main newscast. I read somewhere that ABC World News Tonight didn't even run a story on the evening news about the election from Labor Day for 8 weeks. So you actually saw a decrease in attention paid during the election as the election got closer. That's never happened before, but the Pew study showed that people got less interested in the election as it got closer. And I think all these news stories had political ramifications, but I think the main ramification is just people generally stopped paying attention to the election, except in the key states where they were bombarded by millions of dollars of advertising. And if you look at the turnouts, the states that had competitive races actually increased turnout from 2010, but the states without competitive races had dramatic drops in turnout. And I think just people stopped paying attention to the election.
And it did become a narrative. It was not, the ad mix never suggested that it became a dominant issue nationally, but in specific races, Arkansas, which was probably had already gotten away from the Democrats at that point, the Republican Tom Cotton made it a big issue. New Hampshire, which the Democrats ended up holding, Shaheen lost ground, and I think her people suggest she lost ground in part because of some of these questions raised by a threat that overseas, one of the first journalists killed also happened to be from New Hampshire, so it was an issue that resonated there. North Carolina, the Republicans, there's a huge military presence in the state, and the Republicans really targeted this issue in those media markets. So, I mean, I think it had some impact, but it really seemed to, more than anything, kind of complicate the message mix for Democrats moving into the fall.
Well, if I could actually add a few other headlines to that, I think it's important to note that one of the things we were doing at the Senate committee was trying to develop a theme. We knew eventually these races had to be nationalized to a certain extent. It's unavoidable in a midterm with an unpopular president. And we wanted to have a coherent theme and have all of our campaigns ready for that. And it really started with Brad Dayspring in the comm shop, and it became a theme of leadership. And we're talking about immigration, Ebola, and ISIS, which all kind of happened August and September. But we can't forget that there's a steady drumbeat throughout the entire year of stories that all got at Democratic leadership in government, or lack thereof. At least that's the way that our campaigns were using it and pushing it, from the Syria chemical weapons, the Bo Bergdahl swap, the Veterans Administration problems, Boko Haram, and just foreign policy was kind of a central theme, but it was far from the only theme. And especially when you were able to start rolling up the Veterans Affairs problems into that, when you make it a military issue, it kind of fits in this security bucket. And what we found is that this steady drumbeat, when we did have these things like ISIS, Ebola, immigration, at the end of the cycle, that it was less about who can stop Ebola, because that's not something you can do as the president, just wave a magic wand, but rather, are you out ahead of this thing? Are you showing true leadership? And it's a theme that took, at least it felt to us, a very long time to build with these smaller things, and really paid off in the end, because in some of our national polling, we were seeing that behind the economy, security issues were the #2 issue, not only for Republicans, but also for independent voters. It had kind of, for a month there, probably September, and then we came back more to economic and healthcare issues. But for a month there, this was the #2 issue. It beat out the economy. It beat out seniors' issues like Social Security and Medicare. It beat out the women's issues, education. It had kind of risen to the top. And that never happened among Democrats, but you kind of had an alignment of issue priorities between Republicans and independents that, to us, it felt like it took a year and a half to build. And as far as I'm concerned, if nobody paid attention until August, that's just fine too, because it worked out. But it was for us more about that thematic and less about these issues popping up when they were convenient.
Yeah,
But
just to quantify, this will just take a minute. Because we put the issues in buckets, you know how we do it in the surveys. And in our post-election, we did our own post-election, 1,000 people on election night. 37% gave us an economic issue. That was the top issue. And they voted Republican 52-45, pretty close. The social issue people were almost equal, where it was health care, Medicare, Social Security, et cetera. It was 34%, and they gave the Democrats an edge, 53-45. But 18% of the voters gave us a security issue, of which immigration was the lead, as well as terrorism, et cetera, these other things. They voted Republican 67-31. So the idea of and we picked it up from groups that we work for, SecureAmericaNow.org, some of the stuff, they perceive the president as weak and the Democrats weak. And these people coming in, whether it's lack of securing the borders, goes back to policy, or I thought Ebola was a straw that broke the back, because they just felt vulnerable. And Americans are feeling very insecure. And when you talk about going into the future, I only see this rising as you head into a presidential election that, whether it's Russia or these other things, it matters, but that 2-to-1 margin for the Republicans. And now you're seeing the Republicans battling over a spending bill, which really is about immigration in their base. It's really about securing the border.
The exit poll showed a very depressed and pessimistic electorate. I mean, for the first time, people think their life is going to get worse for the next generation. The wrong track number is terrible. And talking about leadership, while Obama's leadership is negative, the congressional leadership is even more negative. We had 78% versus 20% disapprove of congressional leadership. So it's not just the leadership crisis of the president, it's a leadership crisis in general, and it's a very depressed, worried, and pessimistic electorate out there on every measure.
I think Republicans were very adept at in their TV ads of creating this image of this really dark, dangerous world, one that's very scary, and like you just said, the mood of the electorate was very sort of scared and pessimistic, and it's a change from 2010 when people were just angry, right? And that's what the Tea Party sort of symbolized, was this national anger. And so if you looked at the Republican ads this year, it was all about Ebola and, terrorists crossing the border, really scary stuff. And I think in a lot of cases it worked.
Okay, I want to finish this session, at least before Q&A. I have one last thing. It's going to take a while to discuss because I think it's really kind of the critical aspect. But I'd kind of like to get everybody's thought on and I want to start with Joe based on the exit data. Then I want to shift to John to talk a little bit about the post-election, national post-election panel that your company did. Start there, and then anybody else, it's open. But I want to talk about what were the key factors, based on the data and your perceptions, what were the key factors involved in the big GOP night?
Well, Obama approval, the first one. I mean, the approval in the exit poll was 44%, which pegged what Sean had projected would be the Republican gain in the Senate. But I do want to point out, it's just this negativity towards government and negativity about the future in general. And when you are worried, you're going to vote against the party in power. I mean, are you worried about the direction of the economy in the next year? 78% said worried, even though we've had 2.5 million new jobs, GDP's growing, stock market's new high. It's 78% are still worried. So those traditional factors of economic growth that should make people feel better are not. The question, we call it the life question. Do you expect life for the next generation of Americans to be better than today, worse than today, or about the same? Better than today was only 22%, worse than today, 48%. So there is just this pessimism and unfavorable about both parties and leadership, both at the president and in Congress. And that was clear from this data.
Okay. John, can you take a minute or two and just kind of run through some of the key findings in your post-election research?
Well, the big thing is the pessimism. We had 64% on the wrong track. What's interesting to me is, even though we won this election for the House, if you look at the generic vote nationally, 51-46, 8% of the voters still disapproved of the job the president was doing, didn't vote Republican. And you also have another, with the 64% wrong track, you have 16% say the country's on the wrong track, didn't vote Republican. And as we talked about yesterday, it was a smaller turnout election. You only 82 million people vote, and you're going to have 130 million people or more in the presidential election next time around. And the Republicans left votes on the table. What's interesting about, there's again non-voters in this fluidity where we did surveys early on in 2013 of people who voted in 2010 and 2012, 2010, 2008, but not 2012. And there were large groups of people that are conservatives and Republicans hadn't voted and didn't feel, and the Democrats, to Raul's credit, and the Democrats, the reason this election was up for grabs, they kept running at Congress at 80% disapprove, and the Republicans would blame the Republicans. Democrats. Republicans would blame the Democrats and Obama, and the Democrats would blame the Republicans, but the independents would blame both. And the ones who were undecided blamed both. And some of those voters didn't vote this time. And we would have those undecided, 2/3 were blaming both, but in the end they kind of tilted that the president had done the worst job. Now the president's a lame duck, and you're going to have this presidential race that I'm sure we'll talk about. But those voters, I'm looking at the Republicans, as crazy as it sounds, even though it was a good election, we left votes on the table. We didn't attract more voters that we could get. There were voters here that are disenchanted with the Democrats that we didn't get. And in the meantime, the plurality of voters in the United States don't like the Tea Party. They don't like the Republican base. And our base, those candidates always talk about running for Congress. I mean, the ones who they say an establishment, we won Tea Party voters. We won the conservative base. The conservative base overlaps with, they may not be Tea Party activists, but they agree with the Tea Party on most of those issues, whether it's immigration or spending, et cetera. So so the post-election here is, even though it, you look at it and you say, okay, we won, there's a lot of fault lines in here for the Republicans, and there's a lot of things where we really didn't maximize the advantage that we had. So, so that's what, to me, the most important part for the survey is looking ahead to the next election. There's going to be more battles inside our party. There will be battles inside the Democrat Party, but there will be more opportunities if the Republicans do the right things. We should do even better in 2016.
Okay, I want to open it up to the rest of our panelists on the broad topic of key factors that you think drove the election results.
Well, I think Joe hit it right, which was Obama approval and the general sourness of the electorate. There's an interesting thing in the exits, which is when people were asked about their own personal financial situation, they're more optimistic in 2014 than they were in 2010. But the wrong track was higher, and the general mood was higher, and the disapproval of the president was obviously worse. There was some separation that people were making about how they felt about themselves and what they thought about the state of the country. And I think the dysfunctionality in Washington has contributed to it. I think this issue of security and nervousness about a world that seemed like it was kind of spinning out of control contributed to that. And in one way or another, the Democrats, and particularly the president, were never able to kind of put together an economic message that married the progress that has been made over the last 6 years with the anxieties that people are still feeling. And I think that the president in particular was so conflicted about what was the right way to talk about the economy that the economic message got submerged and all of these other things came rushing in.
But there's one number on that, because the biggest number in Joel's poll is all the Republicans we think were geniuses this time were not. The president, the biggest number was, if you were the 55 disapproved of the job the president's doing, you voted 83 to 15 Republican. That was the big number. And then but the other part, when you talk about the economics, I mean, the market's over 17,000, the GDP's growing, et cetera, like that. Although China's the biggest world economy now. For the first time since the 1870s. But going back to GDP growing, all these economic things, when we asked in October, no, it was August, is the economy in recession or not? 62% of all voters told us it was in recession. So all this economic goodness has not hit the average person at all. There's a real disconnect between what Washington's talking about when people are seeing their everyday lives.
Raul?
Yeah, I would tend to agree with that. I mean, we saw examples of that in races like in Arkansas where, Pryor lost, but yet they voted for a ballot initiative to increase the minimum wage. And I think that's the problem, is that the middle class is not feeling the economic boom that most others are. I mean, joblessness is at it's one of its lowest rates in a number of years. And so I don't think we should have done a better job of driving home that message and saying, look, Democrats will make sure that you're able to provide and put for your family and put food on the table. We'll be able to, will also enable you to take care of your grandmother should she get sick, and also be able to send your kid to college. And I think that was an opportunity that we could have really honed in on and actually drove home a little bit more. We did kind of see it towards the end, where we did have, and the president did do an economic message that we were getting out, but at that point it was a little bit too late.
After bragging about how my model said 44% job approval, 9 seats, I'm going to walk back a little because in truth, job approval isn't really an answer. It only pushes the question back another step. So I say they lost because of President Obama's job approval. Why was President Obama's job approval at 44%? Because job approval isn't a foundational thing. And so one of the models that I use for job approval, it's by a guy, Brian Newman at Pepperdine, who actually presented it in a grad school seminar that I took with him, and then he published it. But he models presidential job approval off of the economy, and then what he calls good news, bad news. So if there's a month where the economy is bad, it'll sink the president's job approval, but if there's good news, it'll rise further. If there's bad news, it drops further. The interesting thing is that the constant is negative, which in non-geek means that if everything else is neutral, the president's job approval still tends to decline over time. So 2010, this hits on what Dan was saying. In 2010, the stronger factor in the president's job approval really is the economic variables, which are kind of just barely ticking upward. What really hits in 2014 is the good news, bad news variable. Because if you just kind of go through the month by month, the economic things are actually looking pretty good. But then you go through this kind of litany. And I just kind of jotted down what I could think of off the top of my head in order. The gun control push and collapse, Syria, the rollout of Obamacare, the cancellation notices, ISIS, Ebola, the border crisis, just month after month of hits that the president took that I think pushed down his job approval and offset what the economy would be bringing about. So I think, and some of those things are conscious choices that the White House made that really made me kind of scratch my head. But you know, some of them really were kind of out of its control. One other quick thing, the one, and this might get to explaining the discrepancy that we see on how people perceive their personal finances. The one economic variable that isn't good is what we call real disposable income, which is basically household income after you subtract out taxes and a number of other variables. That has not been improving. And I think that is how people, the variable that lets you know how people perceive their own finances, and it might explain why people still think they're getting in a recession because they haven't gotten a raise in 5 years.
If I guess looking at the Republican win, if there are kind of, I've thought about this a bit, but they're really like, you know, the four traditional buckets. There's the map, there's the mood, there's the candidates, and then there's the electorate. And on the map, it was a Republican map. There were more states that favored Republicans than there were states. The battleground states favored Republicans more than they favored Democrats, and that just changed based on what seats are up in each two-year election cycle. The mood, obviously, we've talked a lot about Obama. I think the other big thing, which we're now starting to hit on, is this pessimism, which has been kind of a defining factor of the electorate for the last year, despite how people feel. We've been marveling on this disconnect between people actually feel a lot better about the economy than they did in 2010, in large part because if you look at any economic indicator, it's improved vastly since 2010, but they are just as, if not much more pessimistic about the economy. I'm not sure why that is, but I will say, and we ask a battery of questions, which party do you favor on the economy, on Social Security, protecting the border? And on the question of the economy, Republicans, I think, went into Election Day with a 12-point advantage, and that number has really been shifting between each election. The party who's won has been up on that question in our poll in each of the last 4 elections. So I think that was a big factor that, for whatever reason, favored Republicans heading into November. On candidates, we touched on it. But I'm one to not give a lot of credit to the operatives for all their brilliance after the election, but I think Republicans deserve a lot of credit for navigating the primaries, and I think they deserve credit because it's usually kind of this binary either or. They're going to get involved in primaries or they're not going to get involved in primaries. This year, they kind of treated every race as it was a different thing. So in Mississippi, you knew exactly where Senate Republicans were, and they were pushing very hard to prevent this guy, Chris McDaniel, from getting the nomination. In Iowa, we never had a chance. We never had a sense who you were pushing. It just seemed like Joni Ernst organically emerged as the strongest candidate from the primary, and there were a lot of examples in between. They really seemed to address the question of the primaries with a, I guess, a more deft touch than they had in past elections. And then the last thing is the electorate, which Sean's actually written some good stuff about this. You know, Republicans aren't always going to win. The electorate is not the single reason why Republicans win in midterms and Democrats win in presidential years. But the fact does remain that the electorate was a lot older and a lot whiter than it is in a presidential year. That is always going to be a demographic that favors Republicans. And for that reason, I think they did have an edge. But I also would want to tip my cap to the Democrats because looking at a handful of this top Senate battlegrounds, They set out at the beginning of the cycle to go find Democrats who had voted for Obama in 2008 and 2012 who did not vote in 2010. And it looks like in a lot of states, they got those people to turn out. The problem was there weren't enough of them. And when you're down 5, making up 2 points doesn't really matter on election day. And it looks like they were able to find 2 or 3 points in, say, North Carolina. But, you know, if your candidate's at 47, or 46, that's just not enough.
If I could add one thing to this, we've talked quite a bit about the electorate, the map, all of these things. I think from our perspective, it's really the candidates at the end of the day that we were able to work with, that we were able to recruit. And there's 2 in particular that I want to focus on, because when we talk about the map, there were 7 states that were Democratic held that we picked up that Romney had won in 2012. And not to diminish any of those victories, but just to focus on kind of the toughest races, which I think there were 3 states that we were focused on that Obama had won, and at the end just focused on in terms of the money that was coming in from us and other national groups. And you look at New Hampshire, Iowa, and Colorado that way. And I think what you'll see when you get down into it is, yes, the national mood helped, and the security issues and Obama's approval, and there was kind of a sense of buyer's remorse in some of these states when you look at the late polling and some of the exits about Obama. But at the same time, if you go to Real Clear Politics, which has a great graphic for this, and look at the polling over time in those 2 states, you'll see that these are candidates who had to make up ground. They started behind by 3, 4, 5 points, and then the line curved up, and they had to win people over. And to a certain extent, we overlooked the impact that a persuasion campaign can still have in this electorate. We have so much data that to a certain extent we talk about it as if, I know where my guys are, I just have to go get them. And I think especially in those 2 states, there was a persuasion campaign that won over a lot of voters, especially when you compare a state like Colorado and you go back to 2010, where regardless of the fact that most of the polling was wrong, it was very static. There was no movement over the last 6 months, and Cory Gardner didn't have the same luxury. Had he remained static, he would have lost. He had to find 5, 6, 7% of the electorate that he could convince that he was going to be a good senator, that he was going to work for them, that it was worth their vote. And I think that's a factor that, while it doesn't play out in every election or every race, I think especially in those 2 races, you can really see that these candidates had to go out and win over new voters that they wouldn't necessarily have gotten in a 2010 style electorate, where, as was mentioned earlier, it was just anger. In this pessimism, we had to give them a ray of hope, a ray of optimism in some of these places. So I think a lot of the credit has to go to the candidates in those types.
Okay, I'm going to open it up to Q&A. I've run quite a bit over on this session, so we're going to run it into, it's been so fascinating, we're going to run this into the break a little bit, but we'll still have 15 minutes or so for the break. So if you would, Christina, do you have somebody? Okay, let's go. Let's move quickly, everyone. Jesse?
Thank you all for coming today. What would you say was the role of 24-hour news networks in determining the result of the election, and how will that role evolve in future elections? Will it decline, or will it push the electorate farther apart? And I'd appreciate both parties' views on this, but anyone can answer.
Who
I
wants
was
to
going to
jump
defer
in?
to the journalist
Oh,
because it
yeah,
seemed
I was-
easier.
yeah.
But I mean, the short version is that it requires a much more aggressive communication strategy, but at the same time, you can't believe your own bull to a certain extent, and that's the danger of the 24-hour news cycles. When you push so hard every hour of every single day, sometimes you start to believe it and you lose track of the bigger picture. And I think from a professional perspective, the most important thing is, yes, we do need that more aggressive communications campaign. I think many of our campaigns did a great job at that. I think Brad Dayspring at the Senatorial Committee did a great job. Matt Cantor and Boraski at the DSC also did a great job of just being on top of it. There were constantly these, the Twitter wars and all these, dueling press releases. And it's what you have to do to stay ahead of these news stories. I sat right next to Brad Dayspring in the NRSC, and oftentimes I'd learn of breaking news from his Twitter feed before I'd hear him say something in his office next to me, because that's the first place it has to go. Before he even has a conversation with somebody, he has to push it out there. But at the same time, you need to remember that we have to retain some of the perspective to make strategic decisions, because if you just listen to our Twitter feed, we should have invested, $10 million in Oregon and $10 million in Michigan, and not that they were bad campaigns, but you simply have to make the hard decisions when you have limited resources to maximize them. So it's kind of a dichotomy professionally, at least the way I see it.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we have to stick to our issues that are going to motivate our voters and keep that as a constant. That's not to say that, you know, the Twitter and all these other number of things aren't important. And, you know, the journalists will be able to talk to it a little bit more than I can. But, you know, you also have to keep on top of it. And I often, too, myself, find out stuff on Twitter, too, because, you know, it takes longer for them to walk to my office than it is to plug something in real quick in a certain amount of characters. So it does shape the political landscape. I think it'll continue to. But, you know, you can't jump every day to whatever the soup du jour is. For that day and react to it. You know, there's some stuff that will rise to the level of you absolutely have to react to it, but I think staying to your core base values is important and will drive the message back to where you want it to come back to.
I think the important thing to keep in mind on the cable nets is that they've basically become the way that the parties are communicating to themselves. I mean, they're not driving swing voters. I don't know what the demographics are, but you know, Fox News is talking to core conservative Republican primary voters. MSNBC, to the same extent, maybe not with the same reach, is talking to more liberal, traditional Democratic voters. So, I mean, it's a way that the parties talk to each other. I don't know how much it really tips the balance one way or the other. I'm sure that's a longer debate.
Alex?
You know, there's been some comments on turnout. Did any of the polling after the election find out why people don't vote in the midterm elections?
Biggest reason they don't vote is they aren't given a good choice. If they're not given an interesting choice, they're not going to turn out. In the races where a lot of money was spent and good candidates were running and the stakes were high, they came out and voted. A couple facts from this year we haven't mentioned yet. There were 77 House districts where there wasn't a two-party race. 41 seats where the Republicans didn't nominate a House candidate, 36 seats where the Democrats didn't nominate a House candidate. You're not giving voters a choice in that case. Why come out and vote? I mean, you know, you're talking about the Cantor race. There was actually a choice, and there was a reason to vote, and people came out and voted. If voters are not given a choice, they're not going to vote.
And I think part of it too, also, is just voter apathy too. The numbers of Congress are in the dumps. But and again, getting back to your point, there's not a reason for people to do that. And so it's our job at the parties to make sure that we're giving people a reason to vote, and that's what we're looking at, and making sure that we have that right message to make sure people want to vote, because it's an important function of our government and our democracy that people need to go vote. And so we really want to instill that with folks and get that message out there.
I have no empirical data to back up his statements. I'll take it for what it's worth. But I think there was more money spent this time by both parties to identify and get out their voters in these competitive races than we've ever seen. The flip side of that is the nature of almost all of those races was one designed to depress turnout, just by the nature of the advertising, the saturation level of the advertising, and in a sense the miniaturation of the messages that people were putting out. This was not a campaign in which you saw a lot of positive messages going out to try to convince people to vote. So you had that, you had that kind of clash. Mechanically, I think both parties did pretty well in getting out a lot of their voters. But the nature of campaigning, and because the electorate is sour to begin with, the nature of campaigning didn't give a lot of people a reason to feel good about coming out to vote, even if they did.
And just as a quick note, I think turnout, obviously it was a historical low, but I think it was up in 14 states, and I think, I'm making this up, but I think it's roughly 8 of them were Senate battlegrounds. So, but it was very marginal.
Yeah. Okay, Christina?
This is a sort of turnout question. On the Democratic side, well, both of you, in the Cantor race, it was analyzed that you had Obama Democrats voting with the Tea Party. Could it be you had that overlooked element, conservative Democrats, who saw they had a chance to impact the immigration issue, blue collar? And similarly, on the Democratic side, do you think you had excellent senators, national figures, Pryor and Landrieu and all, famous names you'd all. Perhaps you all should have paid more attention to the down ballot and maybe give those guys some money, but let them run their own campaigns. They knew what to do. But pay attention to the down ballot, and that would give you the strength to have perhaps buoyed them. So those are a two-part question, but it has to do with the problem of overlooking.
Yeah.
I was going to say the first part, that your part about conservative Democrats coming in, they weren't conservatives. They were left of center liberals coming in. And the one thing to note is, like a lot of these states, whether it's Virginia or Georgia or whatever, when you go back and you look at the conservative Democrats don't exist anymore like what you think. They're not there. It was more productive for Governor Dillon in Georgia to go after African-American voters who called themselves conservative than try to find white conservative Democrats. Because I tell people, after Reagan, Bush, Clinton, Bush, and now Obama, if you're a white conservative Democrat, you're really rare because they've switched over. That's why the Republicans are competitive now. They've made the switch. So.
And I would just say, look, we hit the mark where we needed to hit the mark in terms of the women coming out to vote, Hispanics coming to vote, and African Americans coming to vote. And so, we need to concentrate and start looking at how we talk to white males, quite frankly. And so, the other to answer the second part of your question on the down ballot races, I couldn't agree with you more. I came up, like I said yesterday, through the party structure and making sure that we empower the state parties and we empower the state and local candidates to run their campaigns as they see fit. Because there's a couple of reasons why you do that. Because one, like you mentioned, they know the local area, their constituents can relate to them, and they're taking care of their constituents on a day-to-day basis. And the other reason why that is extremely important for us as the Democratic Party, as we continue to build the Democratic Party and make it stronger for future elections, is that allowing these folks to do that will build the bench for us and as we move forward. And so some of these candidates that get elected to state legislatures, to state houses, are going to become, state senators, and they're going to become, whatever, office they run for, they'll get elected to those. So it's extremely important for us, and I do agree with you on that point.
Anybody have any? Christine, you got a question?
Yes, thank you for coming, and it's been enjoyable. Would any of you have an opinion with regard to the idea that called the sales volume of Hillary Clinton's recent book, the relative sales volume for such kinds of books, are any sort of indicator of how she would perform as a candidate in 2016?
No.
You know what I like is the New York State Governor Cuomo released a book, and I think his girlfriend sells more cookbooks in a day than he sold totally.
Was that the shortest answer?
Yes, that is definitely. You get the award for the shortest answer of the entire conference. Mr. Montgomery.
I was wondering if our national panelists could give us some insights as to why the polls here in Kansas were so consistently wrong, overstating the Democratic vote share and independent in the case of Orman, including the exit polls. The exit polls were wrong and predicted a Davis victory.
Well, I think there's two things that went on in the Kansas polls. One is the governor's race was a close race and was consistently a close race. And no matter how good the polls are, pre-election polls or election polls, if it's a 2 or 3 point race one way, it could end up a 2 or 3 point race the other way, which is what we saw in both the exit polls and the pre-election polls in Kansas. In the Senate race, there was movement, and I tried to allude to this yesterday. When I do work with the Marist poll, and they did 2 state polls here in Kansas for NBC News, and I work with them on the likely voter model. What was very interesting in Kansas is what Marist does is ask party registration and party ID. Most state polls only ask party ID. Marist here in Kansas did the poll, they asked both. There were a lot of, the registered voters stayed the same. There's a plurality of Republican registered voters. 48+% of the vote is registered Republican. In both polls they did in late September and late October, that number stayed the same. But in the late September poll, people that identified themselves as independents outnumbered those that identified themselves as Republican. By the late October poll, that had flipped. And basically, there are a lot of registered Republicans that at the end of September were entertaining the thought of voting for a Democrat for governor and voting for an independent for Senate. And the Republican campaign picked up on that and spent a lot of money in the state to remind those registered Republicans that you want a Republican-controlled Senate. You want a Republican in charge of the state house to appoint judges. You are deep down a Republican. I know you flirted with it because you have problems with Brownback, you have problems with Roberts, but in the end, you're a Republican. And I think that was the movement you saw in the Senate race in the last 4 or 5 weeks of the campaign.
Yeah, a concept and then the answer. The concept is what we call herding, which is the idea that pollsters, especially not so good pollsters, look at what other pollsters are saying, and if they're too different, they kind of say, well, maybe I should have let more Republicans into the poll, and it brings things back towards the center. Well, the problem is, what if the herd's wrong? Well, the pollster doesn't care, the public pollster doesn't care as much because there's safety in numbers, and if I'm going to be wrong, I'm going to be wrong with everyone else. So there's the concept, put that in the back of your mind. The analogy, or the metaphor, I guess, we were using, simile. The simile we were using for Orman was that he was like a skier out running an avalanche. And if you look at the polls for like September and October, that's exactly what happens. Like, he's here, and Roberts just comes up like this. And then something interesting happens when the lines meet, which is that they stop. Roberts stops, and Orman stays straight, and they actually kind of both go down a little bit. It's like people, but in retrospect, that was people becoming undecided. And so I think you kind of look at that and say, okay, that's what the public polls were showing. So what's the explanation? And why, incidentally, were the public polls in Kansas off more than the governor's polls were? And so I think part of it is that there was herding going on. Everyone was kind of looking around at everyone else and saying, okay, you go first. You be the one to show Roberts ahead, because that would change the entire narrative. And I don't think anyone would do it. And the second thing is that I do think with Orman there might have been something of the typical drop-off we see with independent candidates. They almost never get what the polls say they will get on Election Day. That's typically when they're a third party, but I think it might have materialized here somewhat with an independent, in part because he doesn't have the Get Out the Vote network in place that a party candidate would have. He doesn't have a lot of the same advantage. There's no tradition of voting independent for a guy like Orman as there is with Republican and Democrat. So I think that probably hurt him on Election Day as well.
Yeah. And I would say to that, look, polls are good for you when they're good for you, and they're bad for you when they're bad for you. I tend to talk to, in making decisions, and I talk to a lot of people on the ground, and we were talking to a lot of people on the ground here, and there was a lot of excitement and a lot of momentum, and so to the point that we, as the DNC, even actually invested in the state party here and actually, gave money, and that normally doesn't happen. And so, but to your point, is that at the end, the Republicans came in and did a great job in reminding people that they are Republicans, and that just fizzled out because that's going to trump us here in Kansas. So,
Do you have any other questions? One last question here, and then we will adjourn and enjoy our break and wait for the next session.
If Democrats had done a better job of communicating economic positivity, would have a voter turnout increase, at least for Democratic candidates?
Yes, and I think I alluded to it a little bit earlier in some of my answers, and I think we needed to do a better job in that. I mean, there's a lot of components to what could have and should have happened. With the messages of immigration and so on and so forth. But I think if we did start to focus on a little bit in a more targeted way and got that message out, I think that would have been helpful. Would it had yielded the numbers that we needed to get to be more victorious? That I don't know. But we're going to be looking at that stuff as we continue with this task force that we're putting together for the Victory Democratic Task Force, and we'll definitely look at something, and we'll definitely look at that, and hopefully I'll be at a panel at some point, and we'll be able to deliver those for you.
You know, I would add that I don't necessarily know that this would have had an impact. I don't know anything in a hypothetical, but
Right.
I don't think it would have had any necessary impact on turnout. I think that's something that could have had a big impact on the persuasion campaigns I was talking about in Colorado, definitely, potentially Iowa, where we saw there was a very steady growth. We talk about the target groups that everybody was going after. When you get down into a poll and you look at the crosstabs, one of the ones that you always have to look at in a state like that is the independent white women. You know, it was a lot of women's issues from Democrats. It was also a target for us. We talked a lot about birth control and other economic factors that we were pushing, but it was certainly, whatever the issue may be, you had to look at where your ballot was among those women. And what we saw was a steady growth throughout the entire campaign. One of the reasons I talk about it as a persuasion campaign, but at the same time, it stalled a little bit over the summer. I think one of the things that a lot of people didn't realize at the time, and we got onto other issues like immigration and Syria and ISIS, but over the summer when the legislative body was being used to campaign, essentially, there was a message of student loans and minimum wage, and we're going to get you a job. And Democrats basically said, I'm going to make sure that, you know, your son makes more money at the gas station so he can afford to go to college, and when he gets out of college, there's going to be a job waiting for him. And that's what they were saying to a lot of these voters with their legislative agenda, and it kind of got lost to a certain extent. So would it have necessarily changed things in Arkansas? I don't think it would have made a difference, but in a state like Colorado or potentially a state like North Carolina, where kind of everybody was upside down by election day, I do think there's potential impact there.
You know, I think the reason Democrats didn't do that is that there's a danger in sounding Pollyannish, right? I mean, you don't want the president going out and saying how wonderful things are when people are looking and they haven't gotten a raise in 5 years. At the same time, this is something we were talking about at dinner last night, there's no such thing as a lukewarm hell, right? I mean, the perception was already the economy is lousy, and you know, if the president oversells things, I don't think things can really get any worse. So I thought putting out a positive, or trying to put out a positive economic message was all upside from the point Democrats were. And I agree, I don't think it would have really changed. I don't think it would have cost Democrats any races if they'd put out a stronger economic message. I don't think it would have made a difference in Arkansas, but in a place like Colorado, North Carolina, I think it could have made that case and maybe, you know, switched 1%, which would have been enough.
I think we're going to conclude session 2 with that question. I would tell you that we'll start session 3 promptly at 11:30, which is about 18 minutes from now. And it'll be a fascinating session, so don't go away, folks. Please thank our panelists for this wonderful session this morning. We'll see you back shortly.
Yeah.